one office in Bangor on Garreg Road, and it's called Ysgol. And here we are developing a wildlife garden at the back. So for those of you who want to visit, well, when there is no lockdown, you're very welcome to come. And I also run volunteer days here, and we have developed this garden over the last 2 years. And that is actually, I think I'm going to try and put together a little film about that, because a lot has happened in 2 years. So that'd be nice to share that with you. And we can still, as a wildlife trust, we can still run volunteer events out and about. And we have an office over in the northeast at Andrena, where part of staff work. Again, we look after nature reserves, and we do work with the community, people engagement on different projects. We have a teenage project running at the moment. We have obviously a big project, well, it's the Living Seas Marine project. And we work, Ewan and I do a lot of work with schools and communities, although that's gone a bit quiet lately. But we are still doing as much as we can. So what's the time? 4 minutes, 5 minutes past. Okay, people are still coming in. I'll wait 1 more minute and we'll get going. It is, I mean, welcome everybody. The one good thing about this is, of course, that people don't have to travel far to come to a talk. So that's always an advantage. And I can see that people have entered from Sweden. So that's nice to know. So for all of those of you who are listening to my accent, you might already be guessing where I'm coming from. So there we are. I'm Swedish, but I lived here for a good number of years, and living in North Wales, I've learned Welsh as well, which is essential for the work I do. Okay, hang on. Right, okay. Right, okay. I think I shall start. Right, so for some of you, you've heard it a few times. My name is Anna Williams. I work with the North Wales Wildlife Trust as their education and community officer over in the Northwest. So I cover Anglesey, Gwynedd and Conwy. And I have a colleague in the Northeast, Ewan Edwards, and so he does all the counties over there. And together we do work with schools and communities. A lot of it is wildlife gardening. So that is what the talk's going to be about tonight. I will do a separate talk just about school gardening and how to engage with schools. If some of you are interested, or if you have friends who are teachers, that will be advertised at some point. So the Wildlife Trust. I don't know how much you know about us, but we are a small organization and we are independent. And okay, I can see somebody's face there. Could everybody please turn their videos off, because we're recording it, and then it's best if we don't have everybody showing. Sorry about that. And then also everybody put themselves on mute while I'm talking, but you're very welcome to join with questions at the end of the talk. Okay, so I work with the Wildlife Trust. We've got a website and you can check us out, what we do. And if you support our work, you are very welcome to join us. It's a membership organization and the information is there. You're also welcome to join us as a volunteer. We have regular volunteer parties and they are still happening now. And I also have volunteers who have helped me over the years on my various projects, which you'll hear more about. So, right, let's get going. Wildlife gardening. Gardens, as I'm sure you all know, because that's probably where you joined this talk, are very important habitats for wildlife. They form green corridors in our cities and urban areas, and I don't know if you've ever looked on an aerial photographs of cities, but it's quite staggering to see the network they create. And of course, these networks of green areas are important for wildlife to be able to move along and across cities and other areas. The size of gardens is pretty impressive. In England and Wales, altogether is about 3% of the total land area, which is actually more than all the 3 Welsh national parks put together. So it's not a small area. And of course, this area can be managed in many different ways. And we want to try and influence people to manage it in a way that's good for wildlife. So you can see the contrast of the 2 houses, which are actually neighbours on the photographs. Unfortunately, a lot of front gardens have been lost to either car parking spaces, decking, paving, because people maybe think they haven't got time to look after the gardens. Though this is a great shame for biodiversity and also flood control and rainwater runoff after big heavy downpours. And I think in London, it's something like 1 Hyde Park is lost every 5 years in London to decking and paving of front gardens. So it'd be good if that trend gets slowed down. So wildlife-friendly gardening is kind of obvious. It's gardening with nature in mind. In everything you do, you try and think about the wildlife and why am I doing this? Stop a moment to think. So most gardens, all gardens really, will attract wildlife, but some are much better than others. And you can probably see the photograph there, a lovely border full of flowers that will have nectar. So that will be good for attracting insects. And the other one, you've got lovely climbers for birds to hide in, and that will also be good for wildlife. So I'm going to go through the different options one by one. Right, how you can attract wildlife. Shelter. The first, I think, most important ingredient in your garden. If you start with an empty patch, always create windbreak, whether it's in a hedge or a fence, but I'll talk more about that later. Wildlife needs food, just like us, and water, same as us. So what we are doing, we're creating different habitats, but contrary to what some people think, a wildlife garden does not need to look wild at all. Wildlife gardening is now fairly commonplace, but even 20 years ago, when it first started appearing, say in Chelsea garden show, the first one, I think it was entered as a wildlife garden, but they misread it and called it a wildfire garden. So now it's commonplace. Only 10-15 years ago, it wasn't. So anyway, let's start with the shelter, hedges. I'm just giving a few ideas of good native plants to put into your hedge. I'm not going to read all the names. I'm sure you can do that yourselves. So a variety of different trees is always good because different animals will feed on the different leaves. So different butterflies, moths, and birds, of course, will eat the fruit of some of these if you let them grow. It's very nice to include some honeysuckle or dogrose in your hedge, create a little bit of flower interest. And you can have bigger trees like ash and oak as well. Of course, hedges can be managed just by clipping back or by being laid. So the bigger trees, they work well for that. I've produced some rather sad statistics, and since the Second World War, we've lost 16,000 kilometre hedges due to intensive farming. That's a lot of hedging. And of course, losing that valuable habitat leads to decline in animals, bees, hedgehog, birds, etc. So it's not surprising that we are in the situation where we are, because this has happened on a large scale. Obviously not just in gardens, but in the countryside, in the farming community. And now I think people are waking up to it. So I think hedge planting is hugely important on farms, around gardens, and everywhere in your countryside. Another thing that hedges are important for is actually to avoid soil erosion. And certainly in some areas in mid-Wales where the uplands have gone rather bare, monoculture grasslands, you can see soil erosion and soil creep. And there, to improve the situation, I think for wildlife and for our environment, flood prevention, we do need to plant hedges in the zone between the higher uplands and the lowlands for sure. And that's also an area where we need to create more meadows and other habitats. More of that later. Okay, so show some of my projects. When you plant a hedge, you can do it in different ways. When I do it, certainly in public spaces where people might not be going around weeding and looking after the trees, I make sure that we plant through a weed membrane. You can see the girls putting it down. And then we make slits in the membrane for our little trees. Trees are not big at all, and that's good. It's good to start small with the whips. And either you can plant a single line hedge or a double hedge. And in the double hedge, you make a kind of zigzag pattern, and we plant about 6 trees per meter. So 50 meters is a lot of little trees that are getting planted. And this particular day in Pentrefoelas, we managed to do, I think, 50 meters just in the morning. So reasonably quickly and efficiently. And there, it's a good job done in the morning. It's great to do it with the children. They certainly rise to the challenge, and it's always interesting to see them organizing themselves. We put the trees in, and then we cover up the membrane with bark, wood bark. Of course, if you're at home, you might forget about the membrane and just cover it around the hedge trees with wood bark for a few years. Make sure that you keep on top of the grasses, because the grass can definitely swamp the newly planted little hedge trees. This was in Ysgol Rhiwlas, which is a school that is very exposed in Snowdonia, and they needed protection from the winds and also making this ugly fence look a bit better. The little girl there with the wheelbarrow, she was amazing. I think she's only 6 to 7, and she was battling along with a big full wheelbarrow. And I think her friends were really good at keeping back and not helping her, because she wanted to do it all by herself, and she managed. Right. So I've talked about shelter, food and shelter, and of course the birds will nest in your hedges. I used to run a wildlife garden competition, and again we saw this garden on the right in this picture down on the Llyn Peninsula, and there was a couple who moved in, and they had a small field which they sort of turned into a garden. First thing they did was to create this hedge in the background, because they realized, I mean, they're good gardeners, and they realized they couldn't grow anything unless they had protection from the Irish Sea. And they also left a big area to grow into meadow, and they were very lucky to have a huge number of orchids coming up in that meadow. Bottom left picture is a school in Wildflower, which I know well. And again, when I come in there to visit, it was great to see that the children knew exactly where the birds were nesting. The blackbirds were nesting in that hedge. And I feel like for all children, those are good memories. And those are the sort of things that we want to encourage children to discover. Of course, you don't just need traditional hedging as a boundary. You can have other types which are good for wildlife. The right-hand pictures was in a school garden in Bontnewydd that I was involved in developing. They didn't have much money, and we just done it on a very low budget, and we wanted some kind of fence to divide it from the school field and the footballs. And I had some willow left over from making willow domes. So I looked this up and we made this low fence by sticking the willow sticks in a good foot at each end, and then bending them over and poking the tips in. As you can see on the bottom right hand photo, they took, and we now have a rather successful hedge, which after a few years we can just trim as a normal hedge. In the beginning we would weave in the sticks that were coming out. So that was a very quick and easy way to make a willow hedge. Stone walls abound in North Wales, and they are great for wildlife. So if you have a stone wall, look after it, and if you don't, maybe you want to create one. Here is a stone wall actually where I live, and one of the first things I did when we came there was to plant on top of the stone wall. A good habitat for obviously alpine plants or anything else that you see suitable in growing on your stone wall. The birds are nesting in the walls. We used to have redstarts, and sometimes you might see a wren coming out. Toads, the toads and slowworms will find shelter in there, and you might also have small mammals like shrews and voles in your stone wall. So good for a number of different animals. Also good site for hibernating insects, and certainly when my kids are small, they used to enjoy going and finding little hibernating ladybirds in there. So the obvious ingredient, I think, in any wildlife garden is a tree or trees. They create height and interest in your garden, and of course they provide homes for a huge number of wildlife or insects. So the oak tree, I think, is one of the best ones in Britain. Over 276 different species can benefit from oak trees. The rowan, which is full of lovely red berries at the moment, provide food for the birds. And rowan, interestingly, they were planted near houses in Wales as a protection for witches. And in Scotland, definitely was a taboo to cut down rowan trees. Rowan trees are quite amazing trees. They're very strong, and up in the uplands you see them, one of the growing up high in very harsh conditions. So one of the survivors. I do personally love silver birch and cherries, wild cherry, bird cherry. And the right-hand picture is a cherry tree that we got from Gwynedd Council when one of our sons was born in '97. So in 23 years, it's grown mighty tall. And I must say that was a great initiative by the then biodiversity officer and tree person, Jill Jackson. So those are the sort of small little gems that can happen locally. Right, what else? There's a number of good trees. Obviously you choose a tree depending on the size of your garden, but choose them wisely and you'll reap the rewards. The trees in the bottom left-hand corner are oak trees, which I grew from acorns, again with the children, and we planted them a good 23 years ago now, and today they're actually closing canopy. So we've got a little oak forest. Some more ideas for you. Blackthorn form fantastic hedges, especially in our exposed and windy geographic area, North Wales. And the blackthorn flowers, they come out before the leaves come out. So I find them very attractive and welcome first flower. Could be early March. And then you've got the hawthorn on the right hand side. They are later flowering in May. And those flowers are nice to make tea with. And then of course you've got the berries, which are very popular with birds and also people. Elder. I think stick an elder bush in any way you can. The blossoms are great, and the elder is definitely planted and used to keep the devil off. So rowan and elder were keeping the evil spirits from our houses. And here you see the rowan tree again. Not just good for wildlife, but people as well. And now is a good time to go out and forage, collect crab apples, unless you have them at home, make your jellies, and maybe you got some elderflower cordial to enjoy from this summer. Every year I make elderflower cordial. It's quite a big thing in Sweden. I think everybody does it there. And I think quite a few people do it here too. Either just cordial or champagne. Make it in June. If you want a recipe, I got a good one, so let me know. Of course, I go around schools, and one headmistress said something, some very wise words, I thought. She said, I'm not planting a tree here unless it also gives us some fruit, or gives something back to the school that we can use. And I thought, how very sensible. So we have run orchard projects on and off in North Wales, both Ewan and myself. And I was very pleased to be able to go out only 2 weeks ago to Pennygroes in Gwynedd and plant 10 apple trees. They had been waiting since the spring because of lockdown, but now is a good time to plant, so they were absolutely fine. What I tend to do, it wasn't difficult planting with social distancing, because anyway, in all these projects, it's important that the children that do the work. I don't like school projects where contractors come in and create a garden for them. It's all about the process. And as you can see here, well, the children have been digging, and then they're planting, and it's not difficult, but it's good for them to work out what needs doing. And it's important to then to look after them afterwards. Obviously, we stake them, and I make these, or the pupils make these wooden boxes, and those are used to protect the trees from brush cutters and trimmers, grass cutters, because that is the biggest threat actually in the school garden. Here's another orchard being planted on a very wet day. So from trees to decaying wood. I think in every garden you need to have both living materials, the trees and your shrubs, but then also dying and death and decay. So it's very important to have the whole cycle, the whole ecological cycle in your garden, because you'll attract different fungi, bacteria, invertebrates, and beetles that are doing the job of breakdown. They don't need to look ugly. I mean, I think these log piles are quite attractive in themselves. And of course, they're not just good for the decaying organisms, they're also good for live animals such as mammals, and they will all, the mammals will obviously use them to hibernate in, and other small mammals will also use them to shelter in. So yeah, if you cut down a tree, don't use everything for firewood, keep a few for the animals in your garden and for the fungi, and see what comes up. I find them quite attractive personally, so make sure you have decaying wood somewhere in your garden. Right, from trees to meadows. Most of us hopefully have got some good images of meadows, and it's something that we would strive to have in our gardens. There are different ways of creating meadows, so I'm going to go through them in turn and see, you might see some option that suits you, unless you already have one. So obviously the first thing to do is just to leave your grass to grow long. Maybe you already have wildflowers, maybe they've always been cut down and you haven't had time to appreciate what grows there. Even some areas you need to leave for a couple of years before you see what actually might be available in the ground already, in the soil. If you weren't very successful and all you have is grasses, you can always plant plug plants. And these are basically small plants or wildflowers which you can either buy in or you can raise them yourself. You can just sow seeds in trays. A little bit more work. You might have to remove the turf and sow the seed on bare soil. And the seeds you choose, I do talk more about actually in another talk, which is a meadow talk, which I will be doing next week. But try and have as local seed as possible. If possible, try and collect it yourself, if you have permission to do so, or ask anybody like your local wildlife trust or others where you can get your seeds from. Because only get it from reputable sources. You don't really want to buy imported seed at all. You might as well keep it native, especially if you're sowing it out in the wider countryside. That is very important. Fourth option, if you've got a big lawn or fields, is to scarify the sward. If you're on a field scale, you might want to bring in a tractor with a harrow, and you want to create small bare patches of soil, and then you sow your seeds, and this is called sward enhancement. And you can do that in a garden as well. Scarifying can be done after having cut the grass really short, break it very hard, and then make sure that you've got bare patches of soil before you sow in the seeds. Otherwise, it's a waste of your seeds. And now is the time to do it. So yeah, get going. One of the most important pieces of maintenance is that you have to cut and remove the hay once per year. And depending on what you want to use the hay for, if you want to use it for animal, you cut a little bit sooner usually, so you have more nutrients in the grass. But otherwise, leave the grass to grow, leave the flowers to flower and the seeds to drop. So some of it you can cut as late as end of September or end of August, and it does depend a bit on the weather. I was glad not to cut some meadows until very recently because the black knapweed was flowering and the goldfinches were really, really happy to eat those seeds. Sorry, sometimes I get a bit distracted because the thing's coming in on my screen. Anyway, so option 1, no mow area. So here is a garden, our previous chairwoman, Kate Gibbs, lovely garden, and she just left the grass uncut, and there is a wealth of white clover, which has got full of nectar, and you probably know it yourself if you ever pull the flowers off and suck the nectar. It's delicious, and it's popular with honeybees, short-tongued bumblebees, and also other wild solitary bees. Kate and Jeff, they made a lovely wall here with especially lots of little nooks and crannies for solitary bees and other insects. I mentioned plug plants, and this is what we did in a housing association meadow in Bangor. Here are trays full of plug plants which I bought, and the housing association had approached us asking how they could make this little area of grassland more interesting for both people and wildlife. So I thought the easiest way was to plant this, and we worked with the community. We had about 6 locals come out, and in an afternoon we planted, I think, about 200 wildflowers. And a couple of years later, we have a decent meadow, and here you can see the black knapweeds with a 6-spot burnet moth on it. Well, basically, it's full of pollinators. And I drove past it the other day, and I was very pleased to see a whole group of goldfinches feeding on these black knapweed seeds. So that does need to be cut though, and it needs to be cut nowish if it hasn't already been cut. And then next year, the flowers will get a good chance to grow again. All of these plants are perennial that I've talked about, so they will come again and again. Another way to go about it, I talked about removing the turf, and this is what we did in our little office garden in Bangor. As it was relatively small, it wasn't too hard work. We moved the turf to a side, created a little bank, and then we sowed it with the wildflower seed mix. And on the bottom left picture, Sue and Emily are actually walking in the seeds. You have to make sure that once you spread them evenly, they do have contact with the soil. I suppose that's what farmers used to roll in the seeds, so we can walk it in gently. And then if it's not raining, you do need to water them as well in the following months. But sure enough, we normally have rain. You don't need much seed. You need just about 4 grams per square meter. So a very small amount of seeds. And the best is to mix the seed with a bit of dry sand and then spread it like we're doing here systematically. And the result was pretty good. We were happy. And I think the neighbors were very happy. They're actually students living next door. So only a small patch can create a meadow, and why not have a town meadow and hopefully inspire your neighbor to do the same. So everybody, I normally have a little quiz with people here. You can have a quiz with yourselves and see if you recognize the plants. This is a very important flower, the Bird's-foot trefoil, and I recommend that in every meadow. It's an indicator species of semi-natural grasslands. Next one is a field scabious, very popular with most pollinators. Butterflies love them. Black knapweed I've already talked about, or hardheads they're called. And this yellow delicate flower is called lady's bedstraw. It was used as bedding for animals. And again, a very traditional haymeadow flower. Everybody knows red clover. Buttercup, there are 3 different types. This is the meadow buttercup. We have the creeping buttercup, and then also bulbous buttercup that you might find in some meadows. Beautiful meadow cranesbill. It's in the geranium family. Oxydaceae, self-heal, what else? Yarrow, and the all-important yellow rattle. The yellow rattle is also known as the meadow maker, or hay rattle, you might know it as. And it's called yellow rattle because as it's drying, the seeds rattle inside it. And those seeds you can collect and sow. And yellow rattle, you sometimes get questions about them. They are best sown in the autumn. They need a winter to vernalize. They like it cold before they germinate. And the yellow rattle is a great plant in any meadow because they are semi-parasitic. So what they do is that they weaken the grasses, the roots. They tap into the grasses' roots. They steal a bit of nutrients and water. And therefore they create more space for the flowers to grow. So yellow rattle is a very good plant to have in your meadow. Right, we got different type of meadows, which you probably all heard about, the annual cornfield mixes. These are becoming more popular in urban areas, roundabouts, alongside buildings, maybe important town buildings, university in Bangor, and also the Olympic Park. There was an amazing display of colourful cornfield flowers. These are different from the meadow plants. They are annuals and they used to grow in the margins of cornfields, hence the name. They can cope with more fertile soils and they are best sown in the autumn. Now normally I was sowing this meadow in November, which was very late, but that's how it was. And we tried it and you soon see the result. But before I go to the next slide, I just want to say that these ones, they need to be reseeded every year and you need to plough. In the agriculture setting, they would have ploughed the cornfields every year, obviously, for the rye or wheat. And then the weedy species, such as the lovely cornflowers, would also have been ploughed into the soil and then come back the following year. So this was in Llanfrothen. The following year we had a great display of all those cornfield flowers. Poppies, corn marigold, corn cockle, corn chamomile. And they are great for pollinators as well. So we can all create a little corn annual meadow in a border if you want, or dig a circle in your lawn and plant some of these. But if you want easier long term, I would go for the perennial haymeadow plants like I just talked about. So from flowers to ponds. Maybe a lot of you already have ponds in your gardens, but if you haven't, it's definitely the one ingredient that many people tell me was the biggest change in their garden as regards attracting wildlife. So people ask me, when is a good time to dig a pond? Personally, I think you can dig it any time of year. It depends when you have time, do it when you feel like it. I wouldn't dig them straight under trees because of course the leaves will fall straight into them. People used to say that you just need a sunny spot, but it's okay to have a bit of shade. It's not a problem really. The problem is the leaves falling into your pond. You want to have different types of plants, some floaters, some that are under the water, the oxygenating plants, and some plants, the marginal, growing around the edges. We definitely say no goldfish or other fish in your wildlife pond. I mean, a few sticklebacks will be all right, but otherwise the goldfish or carp will eat the tadpoles or the newts and other wildlife that you want. It's important to do the sides and the edges correct. You don't want it deep on all sides. Say you have some hedgehogs who might come for a drink and fall in, they might not be able to get out. So you do want some gently sloping edges, and also that can be a great area. I usually create some sort of beaches with stones, or yeah, stones are pretty good for that. And then the birds can come and wash their wings and have a splash about in the shallow area. Most importantly, here, quite very, very important, never to use invasive aliens. So in a pond, only go with native plants and don't put the New Zealand pygmyweed or other Canadian pondweed, anything with another country's name in it gives you the clue that it's not native. And they do cause big problems in the wider countryside. And crassula is one of those, the Australian stone crop, and the now NRW, they can spend hundreds of thousands, going into millions of pounds, clearing watercourses because of these non-native species having gone out into the wider countryside, blocking up drains and natural watercourses. So in a pond, be very, very careful with what you plant. Probably the obvious to all of you, our toads and our frogs and newts, they lay the eggs in water, and afterwards the actual adults spend a fair bit of time on land, so they're not spending all their time in the water for sure. Just show you a few different designs. This is an outdoor centre in the Mount Gwynedd Valley, and they made a very nice job of designing the pond with the edges, a little bit of rocks, some log piles, and then also long, tall plants along the marginal edges. They are very important for dragonflies, because dragonfly nymphs, which live in the water, they will crawl out and sit on the tall plants, and then they will turn from a nymph into an adult dragonfly over a 24-hour period. So that's something to look out for in your own gardens. So no excuses. If you can't dig down, you can always build up. This was an amazing project I saw in Bangor. They had only a patio, but they built a stone wall and then created a pond inside it. So that's a good little idea. Here are a few ideas of pond plants. I'm not going to read them all out. You can read them and I can give you more advice later. I think they're all on the website. plants around the pond. Of course, most of us probably like the lovely yellow iris or yellow flag, marsh marigold, which flowers early, which is good pollen and nectar plant. Of course, you can have water mint, loosestrife, and forget-me-not and brooklime, all very colourful flowers around your pond. Right, how to make it? Well, dig a hole, and if you want a big hole, get a little mini digger in, but you don't have to. Most people don't have big gardens. It's okay to just dig a small hole. Any size is fine. Then line it and put a pond liner in. Here we actually first put an underlay in, then we got the pond liner, and then we actually put a protective layer on top, which is recycled fleece material that you buy with your pond liner. And pond liners aren't expensive these days at all. You can get flexi liners that last up to 40 years for 20 quid, for we're doing one in our offices now. I think or maybe £40, 5 meters by 4 meters, so it's not expensive. Put all that in, and then either traditionally maybe you put your subsoil in, but if you haven't got subsoil of that amount, we've used it up in this project. We added sand, because you don't want to add topsoil into your pond because that's very rich in nutrients, and that is usually one of the problems with ponds, that you get algal bloom, and that's when the water is too rich, high in nutrients. So, and then of course play around. I played around with some stones. Of course, when you dig a pond, you normally find a few stones, put them back, and they can be habitats for the newts to crawl under and hide. It's also good to make a shallow area. This is the nursery. Shallow area for the frogs to lay their spawn, lay their eggs. And sure enough, this is exactly what they've done. This is my pond at home, and all of this are absolutely packed full of frog spawn. So the deeper area at the back is good for the frogs lay in shallow areas. Toads actually lay their eggs in deeper areas, and they lay them in long strings. Over time, it will naturalize and grow wilder and wilder, and they become home for so many dragonflies, frogs, baby frogs everywhere, newts, and also toads. As I said, you don't need to do big ponds, you can do tiny ponds. And even this one was made with just a plant pot. And one day I was impressed to hear, I talked to the school and they said, oh, we done pond dipping. I thought, oh, that's good. In this little pond, they were pond dipping, and they said they found newts. And I found that amazing. I could hardly believe it. So I thought I better go and have a look. And sure enough, there's a palmate newt in the pond. This is a juvenile palmate newt. So anybody who is skeptic to wildlife gardening and say it doesn't work in a little garden, and this particular garden is actually alongside a road, the newts somehow found it, lay their eggs, and we have got a new generation of newts coming out. Here are just a few more ideas for you. School ponds are a little bit of a mixed blessing, because sometimes if they are large, like here, you have to put a fence around and the children might not be able to access them, obviously in playtime because of risk of drowning. The school up here on the left-hand side, they've put on a cover, which actually in the adverts, you have a vicar walking on it. You can walk on water. So that is safe, a little bit harder to do pond dipping. But these ponds are a fantastic resource for pond dipping, and of course that's the same in your own garden. Or if you have a pond, definitely buy a net so you can see what's in there. And here they are doing exactly that in the bottom picture. Right, we're going through the habitats from ponds to nectar borders. It's obviously very important. I think one of the most important is to choose your plant to suit the site. And I think most of us have done it the other way around, because we like a particular plant and we want to grow it. And I started like that too, but you just realize that this is not going to grow in my garden. So then it's better to just go with nature and go with what grows in your particular garden. So the position aspect is obviously really important. Is it shady, sunny, north facing, east facing? And how exposed is it as well? That's right. Have you got shelter? Because a lot of plants, as I said, suffer from wind damage. I mean, I think wind is almost more limiting factor than any other condition. So do get that shelter in. Soil type, so that's important to know. You probably can guess it roughly from where you live. Is it a nice loamy soil? Is it sandy? Is it chalky, clayey soil? And that will obviously influence what you can grow. But also you can test the pH by buying a pH kit in a hardware store. And that is always quite interesting to see where you are at. And that will influence the flowers you choose and can grow. I mentioned water source because of course some gardens you have limited water. You also want to think about collecting water for your borders, and if you do it in a community setting or in a school, that's hugely important. You don't want to spend masses of money and time for watering. So here are some ideas for borders. Definitely, to me, a good border is packed full of flowers. And it's a good idea to have more than one flower of the same type, because the bees are going from flower to flower and they will go on scent and sight. So do not try to avoid the dotty effect and try and plant in groups. That's better for the insects and pollinators for sure. I'm going to give some names, but these are also available on our website, so don't worry too much, but just a few ideas for you. Try and have flowers throughout the year, and these are all excellent plants. I must say, I think one of the best plants, if you had one plant, I would almost go with marjoram, oregano. That is so full of, it's been so full of bees right through the summer here in our office garden for sure. I do also like these two bottom flowers, the sedums, absolutely full of butterflies, small tortoiseshells, and that is, I took that photo in Ysgol Bontnewydd. And Michaelmas with a comma on the bottom right-hand photo. The verbena, I don't know, verbena bonariensis, has fantastic purple flower, and they are flowering at the moment. Okay, just a little quick journey through the seasons. I'm not going to talk much to these. You can just have a look of flowers that are good to have in your garden throughout the year. If you want crocuses and grape hyacinths, now is the time to plant the bulbs. Never underestimate the amount of flowers that each apple tree has. Excellent for the bees. Lavenders is a go-to flower, and I think the catmint and rudbeckia, I mean, they're still flowering now, so not just summer but going well into the autumn. Honeysuckles, go for the more native varieties and you'll have lots and lots. I was going to say midges, nobody wants midges, but we have lots of midges on our honeysuckle, but you have a fantastic scent, so put them next to your front door and you'll be very, well, you'll be happy for the scent. I've written single rows. When you choose your flowers for the garden, do go for the single varieties, because a lot of flowers are now double petal varieties, you probably know that. And where they've been bred to be double flowering varieties, the nectar sacs are often not present any longer in the flower. So they are pretty useless for the bees and the other pollinators. So go for single flowered varieties. wherever you can. We're coming into the late summer now, with the sedums and the eryngium, sea holly. And of course in winter you can also have a few flowering plants. So that's a little challenge. One can set oneself to have something flowering all year round. A few more for shade. Right, so if your cafe is good, you will get exciting visitors. Hummingbird hawk moth, bottom picture. You might have had those in your gardens. Peacock butterfly on the top left, and the burnet moth in the bottom middle. And this looks like a bumblebee, but it's actually a hoverfly. So once you've got the flowers in, the insects will come. I don't know if you noticed a decline of butterflies in your gardens, but generally over the last 10 years there definitely has been a decline of butterflies, which is a rather sad state. This is just to give you some more ideas, some things that I have done. This was not a very difficult project, and within a morning, well, maybe a day, we planted this herb wheat. The children can do lots of maths. They work out the area, the shapes. We planted through a membrane here, and the herbs are all brilliant plants for pollinators. So actually, that same year, they had a lovely herb garden, and it's still going on years later now. So if nothing else, if you've got a window box, plant some herbs. Most of the herbs, sage, chives, fennel, we've got some feverfew there, I think. They're all good for pollinators. Rosemary, of course, is brilliant. And then they were so happy with the success of the herb garden, they then wanted a colour wheel. So here's another little challenge. We did 6 segments and different colours in each segment. And like most gardeners, you don't have to go and buy all plants. You do ask your friends. Everybody needs to divide and plants and share them. So most of this colour wheel was actually created from plants that I begged and borrowed from friends and family. So not just colourful plants and flowering plants are useful and important in your garden. Nettles are very important food for many butterfly caterpillars. So I tell everybody, don't squash anything that you see and you don't like the look of, because they turn into this. The small tortoiseshell, declining butterfly, but such a beauty. Peacock butterfly, again, their larvae will eat nettles as a favorite food source. And here they are, spiky looking caterpillars turning into this beautiful peacock butterfly. So if you've got some nettles and in your garden, leave them if you can, and then check the leaves and see if you've got any larvae, and well, maybe butterfly eggs to start with, and then they will turn into this larvae and the lovely butterfly. So you probably heard these statistics. We are losing our insects, and that's why everybody, I hope, are getting aware of this, and we need to do something together to stop the decline of wildlife. And a big reason has been the fragmentation and loss of habitats. We have lost 97% of our wildflower meadows only since the 60s, only in my lifetime. It's not a lot, it's not a long time, but it's a huge loss. The pesticides that have come into such prevalent use, again after the war, they also kill our beneficial pollinating insects, which is concerning. Together with climate change, warmer winters, wetter summers, the pollinators have suffered, bees, butterflies, and so on. And as we need the pollinators to feed us, we should all wake up to this and do our own little bit to help. We can obviously, depending on what jobs you all have, you can influence others, and that's hugely important. I think we can all influence our own circles of friends and our own workplace and do our bit. I think it's the only way to move forward, really. A little bit on solitary bees. You probably heard a lot about the bee homes. Here is a leaf-cutter bee on the top right-hand picture. And the female leaf-cutter bees, they cut out oval shapes, and especially they like rose bushes. And here is cutting an oval shape. They'll drag it into the hole. You can see bottom right-hand photo. They drag it in. They then lay an egg, drop some pollen off that they collected in our gardens, and make a seal. And then they do lay another egg, pollen, seal, pollen, egg, and they seal it off. And I'll show you a picture soon. So the leaf-cutter bees, they will use hollows like in these logs, probably a bit bigger diameters, not the small ones, it's 2, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 millimeter diameter. And then they will do that in the springtime, and then the following year the adults will emerge. You can also have the wasps, solitary wasps, and wasps aren't bad. Wasps are good. They are excellent at controlling pests in our gardens. Just show you a few ideas of different types of homes for solitary bees. And this particular one is the Rolls Royce of solitary bee houses. This one is made by a company called Nectar. And what they've done is to include this piece of glass or perspex so that you can actually see what's happening. And here you can see the bee grub and a bit of wool, and then another grub, and there's pollen or frass laid in each compartment. So they will then in turn hatch out an adult bee in an orderly fashion, starting right at the outside. Those were leaf-cutter bees. We also got another species called the mining bee. I mean, there are plenty of solitary bee species. There are a lot more than honeybees, which most people think of when we mention the word bees. Most species are actually solitary bees. And the tawny mining bees, you might have seen them. They create these little pyramids in your garden, especially like a sandy soil. And then you might see a bee emerging from them. All these records you can submit, and especially with the bees, it's an organization called beewas.com. Moving on to birds. Most of you are probably familiar with feeding birds, but do choose a variety of seeds and fruit. Feed them apples in the winter, and clean your feeders regularly. Not just once a season, a few times every season. Even once a month is a good, it's about a good time to clean your feeders. Squirrel shouldn't really be inside that. I was going to say use squirrel-proof feeders. This one might be in trouble getting out once it's had a good feed. Maker bird boxes, good projects now for the winter. Get them up in this early spring, ready for the birds to come and nest. We had an interesting bird, nuthatch, came and used the bird box. They are not really one of the expected species to use bird boxes. And here you can see it's put a whole layer of, it's collected mud and made it all draft proof, which is in there. So one can always have surprises in your garden as to who will use your bird boxes. It's a good idea if you have metal to put these metal in front of the hole, because you might have experienced squirrels and the spotted woodpeckers enlarging your holes and going in and stealing the fledglings, the little birds. So do make them as proof as possible. Just to show variety. If you have a variety of habitats, you will usually get a variety of animals. And this garden was particularly full of birds in row M. So I'm not going to talk particularly in detail about bats, but all of the suggestions I said in this talk, they will go for attracting bats. Bats are good indicators of the health of our environment generally as well. And I'm sure most of us enjoy seeing the bats coming out on a hot summer's night. They were actually flying only the other day. So it's important to provide food for the insects that the bats will feed on. Every garden definitely needs a compost bin. It's important to have a good mix of the greens, which is your kitchen waste, grass cuttings, prunings, and if you want to speed things up, you can add a bit of manure in there, and your brands. So I put cardboard, newspaper, straw, anything like that. Mix it together, and it's a good idea to have 2 bins on the go, 1 bin active and 1 bin that's decomposing. I think some people say they can make compost in 6 months. I think it takes more like a year in our relatively cool climate. And you can make a smart one here like in wood, or you can also just knock a few pallets together to make a very quick compost. Obviously, in some situations, it's best to use a plastic bin that you can get provided from the council. If you are lucky, or some people might say unlucky, you might find that you have grass snakes in your compost. This was a garden in Criccieth, and she had some fine examples of grass snakes in her compost. So they obviously like the warmth there, and they will lay their eggs in your compost. Not very often, but if you've seen grass snake in your compost, let me know. That's quite interesting. Partly, I know veg gardening is not necessarily wildlife gardening, but I think I'm just going to mention organic veg. It's very important that we do grow our food organically. We do need to do more of that as a nation. And the key thing is to have a healthy soil. Healthy soil gives healthy plants, and then you have less need to go and reach for remedial sprays. Not that you would. So also it's just thinking ahead. Put fleece or net on your veg to avoid various pests and caterpillars. Yeah, outwit the diseases is basically what I would say. And keep your plants growing healthily, and then you will hopefully get a good crop. You can also have alternatives. Copper tape for special plants, ladybird caterpillars, they will eat pests. So that's why it's important to have all different types of flowers in your garden that attracts different insects. You can, this is called a slug collar. I've never tried that. Or some people buy in Acacia formosa, which controls whitefly. So that's a biocontrol. Definitely ditch the pesticides. If there's one message I'd like to get across, is do exactly that. And I don't, personally, I would not want to use it for my own health, and I don't think we should use it anyway because it has effects on everything. And even if they say it's not harmful for this or that, like Roundup, I disagree. And I also think that in a garden situation, we should be able to do it in a way that is good for nature. So, summing it up, the responsible gardener, we need to use peat-free compost, make your own compost if you can, check the source of the garden plants, check the source of materials, don't use herbicides or pesticides, don't disturb wildlife during nesting season. So if you can tick all those, that's great. And if you can't, well, work on it. So moving forward, there are a few things we can do. Manage your own land well, influence your neighbors. We need to educate our children and our teachers. And there will be some more talks on these topics to follow. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm sorry if I went on a bit long, but any questions, pop them in the chat box and I shall read them now. Thank you. Oopsie. Right, okay, sorry, I'm just reading some questions. From Peter to everyone, best way to get rid of slugs? Right, I would quite like, could we, Ian, could we unmute everybody? So on the slug control one, there is different options. What I used myself was we had wooden planks in a veg garden between the beds, and the slugs would chill out under the planks. So then we would go and collect them and chuck them over chuck them over to the neighbour. No, we actually got farmland to the neighbour, or dispose of them how you feel suitable. Otherwise, slugs, if you have a pond, hopefully you might get some frogs that eat the slugs. Also, I don't think you can ever get fully rid of slugs. It's just to maybe reduce the damage. Any of those advices that I showed, you can also put grit around good plants. In a veg garden, I grow extra plants, so I have one row extra along the edges where the slugs can go and munch. But I think slugs is a constant battle. Yeah, somebody's saying encourage toads and frogs, that's true.
Also ducks.
Sorry?
Ducks.
Oh, ducks, I know. Yeah. I was going to say ducks, but ducks can also cause a bit of a damage in the pond, can't they?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, ducks is one thing that I would like to have, but I haven't, because I think they would just make a bit of a mess of the pond. Oh, grass snakes have eaten the frog's pond in my pond this year. Oh, well, never mind. That's a happy grass snake. Oh, that's quite interesting. I think wormery is definitely a good alternative to compost bin. There's a lot of information about wormery, but definitely. Okay, somebody's asking if we need to add water to pond. That is not at all a daft question. That is no daft question, and it depends. I think you definitely can add water, and then they say if it's very chlorinated, you should leave it for a few days for the chlorine to evaporate before you plant it. You can obviously let it fill up with rainwater, but that might take very long. So whatever, you can obviously collect water from in water butts as well, just to help it. But it's, yeah, no, it's fine to fill them up. Obviously, if it's very big, you might use a lot of water. Eggshells to banish slugs, that's a good idea. Another idea is to put a sort of, like a grapefruit, hollow out a grapefruit, put it upside down in your beds, and then the slugs quite like to go underneath there, and you can collect them from there. Eggshells no good. You could try any kind of grit around the plants. But I mean, I think basically slugs are pretty good at getting through barriers that we create. People say coffee granules. Otherwise, plant too many plants and have some sacrificial plants. Oh, good ways to attract snakes. Well, compost, grasses of different lengths. Actually, heather, if you got heather. If you wanted adders, they kind of like a heathland type habitat. But grass snakes, again, if you do have wild areas, don't cut all the grass at the same time. So leave it different heights. And then provide, obviously, you can do the obvious thing, which I haven't mentioned, is to put areas of to put roofing felt on in areas where they might go and hang out under because it's nice and warm, or some corrugated iron. And they will also, we do that on some of our nature reserves. And it's amazing, you find slow worms, snakes, lizards, because it's lovely and warm under those dark surfaces. Oh, somebody's considering membership. Thank you very much, because all your memberships are very important to us. How much sun does a meadow need? Well, that, again, there are meadows that are not in full sunshine. So a lot of meadows originated in woodland glades. So again, if you go on a website, such as Emmersgate seeds, wild seeds, you will have different type of seed mixtures. Some will be good for shady woodland sites, and some will be for sunny sites. Oh, I'm glad you got ideas. How can you make a drive wildlife friendly and car friendly? Oh, I'm not so sure. Depends on the drive, I guess. You could grow things like chamomiles along the center if you have grassy. If it's like a drive with a grassy center, you could grow low growing plants like chamomile that have time to provide flowers for insects. And then, yeah, that's about all I can advise. Low growing meadow flowers in the middle. Okay, a muddy pond. You got ducks in it, so I think that might be why. Ponds go through phases. So even my pond wasn't clear this spring and it was a bit annoying. It's slightly green. You couldn't look down to the bottom. And then I thought, well, what can I do? I can't do anything now. I just got to leave it. And then after summer and now in the autumn, it's lovely and clear and I can see it right the way through. If you need to clear your ponds, which everybody does need to do, actually I didn't mention that, maintenance once a year, then do it in the nowish, October, November, before the winter. But don't clear everything at once, just clear a little bit at a time. And whatever you pull out, put it alongside the pond for a few days, so any beetles or other wildlife can sneak back into the pond. Oh. I'm not sure I call rosebay willow herb a meadow. It's a bit of a monoculture. I mean, they're still good for certain animals, and I like rosebay willow herb, and they're definitely useful, but I'm not sure I call it a meadow, but they definitely have a place in a garden. Right, is that about everything? If you have any other questions, just send me an email. Or if you want a project, if you've got a school or community where you want to develop garden, let me know. Otherwise, I say bye and thank you very much for joining.